In trying to understand Chinese culture, it is best to look at the fundamental differences between Eastern and so-called Western cultures. Drawing on philosophy, we have to understand that Western culture, very closely embedded in the Christian religion, is a culture of guilt, is a culture of individualists. Eastern culture, on the other hand, is a culture of shame, not guilt, and it is a collective culture. This helps us understand why in the West most cultures are very individualistic and tend to be more short-term oriented. It also helps us to understand why most Eastern cultures are more collectivistic, where the benefit of the collective, of the group, outweighs the interests of the individual. Trying to understand Chinese culture, we can look at Chinese culture through the prism of the work of anthropologist Edward T. Hall. He developed a concept of high versus low context cultures. This concept is based on the fundamental premise of looking at how information is communicated. In high context cultures, most of the communication is implicit, coming from body language, coming from the tone. Very little information is actually explicitly given. One has to understand the relationship between the people that are communicating. For example, if there is a hierarchical relationship between the two, this will give different meaning to the same kind of information shared compared to if there is a private relationship between the two. The best example of high context kind of communication is the Chinese aversion to saying no. Being a culture of shame, it is often thought that saying no means losing your face, disappointing the other party. Therefore, quite a lot of misunderstandings have actually occurred where Westerners have misinterpreted Chinese negative responses as actually positive. For example, very excessive smiling means that the Chinese party is actually uneasy, not that it is being very friendly. Very often, a Chinese counterpart, particularly in business, particularly if it is a former hierarchical relationship, would say yes, because simply they would not say no and disappoint the other party. Therefore, it is very important to clarify the meaning and to check, double check and triple check if both sides actually understand the same thing. Being a high context culture, body language is also extremely important. One such example is, for instance, at a dinner or a lunch table, when you're pouring wine, tea, beer to the other person. The Chinese person would very often not say thank you in words, but they would take two fingers and tap them on the table as a sign of humility. Westerners would very often not pick up on these subtle communication cues and would simply think that the Chinese are being rude. The Chinese language itself is perhaps the best example of a high context culture. It has 4 tones, and the different tones actually give the meaning to the word. So the same word written in pinyin can mean coconut or grandfather. It can mean mother or it can mean horse. Colors in China are very important. Shapes in China are very important. The tone of the voice is very important. Body language is very important. These are all very important elements of so-called high context cultures that Westerners very often are not prepared for. The other thing are also relationships. Being a high context culture, Chinese relationships tend to be very hierarchical. At a business meeting, sitting at the table, the most senior, the highest person in position would be the one talking. Very often in the West, everybody in the group would be talking. There aren't no clear seniority differences. This confuses the Chinese. And very often the Chinese side would actually start the meeting by saying, excuse us, can you please tell us who is in charge here? So they understand the hierarchy of the group.